Hey everyone, welcome to week 8. This is your intro video. I want to highlight a few strands of our discussion from this past week and use that to kind of segue from the pretty lengthy narrative segment that we studied this past week, the road to Jerusalem, then into what we have for this week, which is a really rich section of Matthew that I want to try to preview for you a little bit, point out some of the optional resources that might be of interest to you this week, and just try to give you a sense of where we're at here as we come to the final third of the course. So as you will remember, and as many of us discussed this past week, we had this climactic, kind of pivotal scene in Caesarea Philippi where Jesus asks his disciples to say what the people are saying, who they're saying that he is as the Son of Man. Even if the Son of Man is not the way that the people are describing Jesus, this is how he invites the disciples to think of him. And then, of course, he turns the question on them. Peter confesses him the Messiah, the Son of the living God, for the first time in the story, first time that any human being has acclaimed Jesus this way. And we had some great discussion, I think, about how this is a moment of revelation from God. It's not a credit to Peter. And it serves then as the moment, at least literarily, in which Jesus clarifies what it means for him to be the Messiah, what it means to follow him as his disciples, and therefore what it means to be a part of this church that he's building in Israel that will grow in Israel and also begin to embrace all the peoples of the world, as we know. And this way of elaborating or clarifying what it means to be the Messiah includes this terrible future hanging over Jesus that Peter and no doubt the others cannot stomach or even imagine, this future of death in Jerusalem, of being handed over to the corrupt authorities there that his disciples and so many others of their generation have grown to despise, and that following Jesus means carrying a cross, following a similar sort of pattern of nonconformity to the existing regime in the land that draws its attention and can involve being executed by Rome. This does not seem like messianic liberation to the disciples, and we spoke at length about this last week. What I wanted to highlight here, though, is that it's when Jesus is acclaimed the Messiah for the first time and begins to tell his disciples what this means and what it means to follow him, that he tells them that he doesn't want anyone to know that he is the Messiah at this point in the story, that they're not to tell anyone at this point that he is the Messiah. And I'm not sure that we have lingered long enough over that. We often assume that Jesus simply desires to be known as who he is, according to the labels that we have grown accustomed to applying to him: Messiah, Son of God, God in the flesh, something like that. And yet Jesus insists at this point, as he has implicitly until now, that he be known by the way that he teaches, by other actions of his life, by the way that he clashes with authorities. This way of living speaks for itself in a way that no label, even Messiah, could capture, it seems, at least as that might be publicized by the disciples at this stage. So what this tells us is that what it means for Jesus to be Messiah is that he does not want his being Messiah to be announced at this stage. This is integral, it turns out, to who he is. And that should trouble a little bit perhaps our notion of what it means to be the Messiah. how God is revealed in the world, how God is shepherding God's people through Jesus. There's a kind of understated quality to it, a subtlety to it that requires people to be transformed, and not simply to imagine that by identifying Jesus with some category that's currently available to them, however inspiring it might be, that they know him and know what it means to serve him as Lord. So we have to remain sort of captive to the way Jesus lives, following him down this dangerous path to actually know who he is. And as we see in the story, this involves a kind of growing foreboding, ominousness in the story. 3 times on the way to Jerusalem, Jesus predicts what awaits him, the suffering and the death in Jerusalem, each time with an added layer of scandal, adding the second time that he will be betrayed, the third time that he'll be handed over to the Gentiles to be crucified. And so the horror seems to grow at the same time that the energy of the story does, as the disciples converge on Jerusalem and Jesus is focused on them as the kind of beginning of his community in Israel, his church that he is now building. Now, as this comes to the end of chapter 20, into chapter 21, there is a growing emphasis on what it means for Jesus to rule. And it is just as counterintuitive as what he has said about what it means for him to be Messiah. Jesus rules by the way that he serves. And he is teaching his apostles to be judges, rulers of the 12 tribes of Israel, as far as they might be spread around the world, by learning his pattern of service. And this is, of course, again, not what disciples in the story, not what we expect salvation to involve, expect our liberation, our forgiveness from the burdens that we have carried to involve. It seems that the disciples want something a little bit more sort of graspable and something that answers their immediate longings more readily. I hope you resonate a little bit with their frustration, their difficulty in understanding Jesus in these last scenes as they approach Jerusalem, since he is shaking the foundations of their faith as they follow him. And yet we see again and again that despite their difficulty, even their opposition to Jesus in some ways, he refuses to forsake them. He continues to get up every day and to invest in them and to work with them. He has chosen them, and he's building the church, transforming them, empowering them, even as they're struggling along the way. You'll notice as we come then into the rich scenes of this next narrative segment, approaching Jerusalem from the Jordan Valley, coming from Jericho up over the Mount of Olives through the town of Bethphage, and then down the Kidron Valley and into the city, climbing up the last bit into the area of the temple itself, that the pace of the story begins to slow. If you've noticed, the first kind of 2/3 of the story, 3/4 of the story that we've covered up until now have apparently included a significant expanse of time, at least a year, maybe more. Yet we get to this point and it seems like the whole last 1/4 to the 1/3 of the story is a matter of days. So the pace of the narrative is slowing because the drama is intensifying. All the threads of the narrative, with all of their irony, are beginning to weave into these final scenes. So just observe that and try to take that seriously as you study. We, in our study, in some ways, need to slow with the pace of the narrative. As Jesus rides into Jerusalem in a sort of parody of triumphal entry, he's riding on a donkey and a colt. He's not leading an army. He's leading a band of followers. There's plenty that is not impressive about him, and yet there are crowds that are acclaiming him, and he has begun to pose a threat, and there is a surge of scriptural quotations that suddenly crash this scene. We've seen that throughout Matthew, all of the story is rooted in the Old Testament scriptures, but now there's an orchestra of scriptural voices that begin to accompany Jesus as he enters the city. And you're going to want to spend some time looking at the context of those passages that are drawn from. The questions of the first response form invite you to do that. But just to really sit with the epic nature of this moment and how much of the long and dramatic past of Israel has been building to this moment, even if it is the case that so many of the characters, including those nearest to Jesus, can hardly capture what is happening in front of their eyes. It's going to take memory to actually make sense of what they have lived through. That is going to lead then to some tense scenes in the temple courts, a familiar clash that I hope you'll consider perhaps a somewhat unusual interpretation of, the clash in the temple courts where Jesus overturns the table of the money changers who are collecting the temple tax and involved in selling the animals for sacrifice for pilgrims that have come from a great distance. He brings the temple worship to a halt with something to say that involves repeating the prophecy of Jeremiah as well as Isaiah. And then group after group of some of the premier authorities of Israel and the land approach Jesus for a kind of public confrontation, attempting to derail his rising power. And in each case, they are exposed and overcome by the power of Jesus' word. This closes with some words of intense judgment against perhaps the most respected authorities in the land, the scribes and the Pharisees. And don't miss how that begins, where Jesus actually tells the crowds and his disciples that they are to continue to listen to what the scribes and the Pharisees teach because they sit on Moses' seat. That is in a Christian gospel. That's what Jesus says. They are to listen to what the scribes and Pharisees teach. But, he says, they are not to do what the scribes and Pharisees do, since they themselves do not do what they teach. So, again, some subtlety to how Jesus is relating to the authorities in the land and what he is calling the disciples of his growing church to do in the age that is now opening before them. Some of the material this week is designed to help us resist at this climactic juncture the temptation that we have to read this story in an anti-Jewish way, to sort of treat the Jews in general as the enemy of Jesus or something along those lines. And I've tried to provide a variety of resources that I hope will disrupt that tendency and help you to wrestle with the complexity of the Jewish community that is analogous to the complexity of the communities in which we find ourselves today. They can't be easily generalized or oversimplified in the way that they relate to Jesus. There are obviously different groups of authorities and people responding to the competing authorities in different ways. And the article that I've assigned by Shia Cohen is designed to show you that in the generation following not only Jesus' life, but what he's about to predict, the terrible civil war and foreign invasion that culminates in the fall of the temple, Jewish authorities in the generation afterwards came to some of the same criticisms that you'll hear Jesus voicing against the authorities in these scenes. So they came to some of the same conclusions that Jesus delivers to his disciples, to listening crowds, as he is being revealed in coming to Jerusalem as judge, as ruler, as someone with authority to bring justice, to expose injustice, and to set his generation and his people on a course for the age to come, the coming of this kingdom from heaven. Looking forward to the discussion this week.